in the debrief.
Bonjour.
So on behalf of the Privy Council, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the ministers. They're looking forward to hearing your advice. The Minister of Immigration is leading this briefing on behalf of his colleagues, and he will introduce his colleagues to you.
That's right. Welcome. We are very, very excited. Minister of Global Affairs, Finance, ISED, and Intergovernmental Affairs, and a special representative, the Chief Executive of the National Association of Settlement Agencies. Please.
Thank you all for being here today. Please note that our presentation will be in English, mais si vous avez des questions en français ou si vous voulez qu'on répète une de nos diapos en français, on peut le faire. My name is Kyler Woodmass. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Finance Canada.
My name is Mona Awwad. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada.
My name is Monica Smith, and I am the Assistant Deputy Minister in charge of Intergovernmental Operations at the Privy Council Office.
And my name is Andrea Garland, and I am Associate Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada.
The purpose of the briefing today is to provide you with necessary context to understand the request from the United Nations that we resettle the largest share of the 75,000 refugees that they have identified in Yemen for resettlement. We'll be presenting the key options that we have identified, how we evaluated those options, and how we came to our comprehensive policy package, which we believe balances issues at a regional, national, and international level, as well as introducing our implementation plan and our communication strategy.
Now, to go into more background, the civil war in Yemen started in 2015, and since its start, it led to a lot of displaced people and societal unrest. And the United Nations described it as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. There's no end in sight, so the UN's request comes in line with Canada's commitment to the Global Migration Compact and its previous involvement in humanitarian assistance and high levels of resettlement. So there is an international and national expectation for Canada to help in this case.
Some more background is on the mandates of this government and our past policies. So we did look into the mandates of the IRCC, ISED, and the Finance. And the IRCC is the ministry that is leading because it is involved in the providing high quality resettlement services in a reduced time. So in terms of our past policies, Canada has had some resettlement actions, most notably with the case in Rohingya and Syria. So for the Rohingya, we did send a political envoy to determine the situation, which then decided that we should provide funds. And then for the Syrian case, that was a large portion of the last election, and it has caused some positive and negative political feedback based off of what had happened in that situation.
And for background on Canadian immigration, it's important to differentiate between refugee claimants and designated refugees under the UNHCR. So in this specific context, the refugees have already been designated as refugees, whereas there are other situations that we will get into where refugees come to the border at ports of entry or through illegal border crossings and claim refugee status, at which point the Immigration Refugee Board determines the validity of that claim. Regarding the targets of immigration for refugees, Canada has stated that the refugee claims that will be made, or the refugee acceptance rate, will be around this target, and that will be the numbers that are for 2019 and 2020. But our proposal is in addition to those numbers.
Based on this background information on the case, we have identified three potential options for the government to undertake. The first would be to accept a number of Yemeni refugees for resettlement below the 75,000 ceiling, identified as the max capacity, or at least the feasible capacity, of IRCC, given current organizational constraints. The second would be to decline to accept any Yemeni refugees for resettlement and look at other potential options, which we will go into in terms of funding in lieu. And the third would be to accept the full 25,000 identified as the cap for IRCC, or what we will be considering as the cap for IRCC. Our specific recommendation, as noted, would be to accept below the number of 25,000, and more specifically, we have identified a target of 15,000 to 18,800. This target is in line with 20 to 25% of the 75,000 number, which is on par with the number of Syrians we accepted as a percentage of global share of pledges for resettlement in 2016 and 2018, respectively. Specifically, we would be looking at a majority private sponsorship share. We have just identified as a target a 2/3, 1/3 split. And we would also recommend $15 million for IRB to address the backlog of asylum claimants, as Andrea noted, at the border, the majority of which cross between ports of entry. We would be implementing this target and the resettlement in 3 phases: first, coordination, screening, and resettlement. And we evaluated our options through 4 key considerations: international aspects, control, capacity, and political mood, which we will now detail.
In terms of the international consideration, Canada previously used to take a lower level of refugees designated by the UNHCR. However, recently it has overtaken the United States as the top receiver of refugees after taking in the 20% of the Syrians. And this has set an expectation for Canada, especially an expectation that it would respond positively, especially that with its bid to take a seat on the UN Security Council. Another international consideration to take into account is the regional players. This is an opportunity to re-engage with Saudi Arabia by taking in refugees that might otherwise go into their borders. However, we do acknowledge that this may be seen as a risk because Saudis are involved in the conflict, and this may be seen as Canada's indirect involvement in the conflict as well.
Another key consideration is for Canada to remain in control of the screening and resettlement processes. So in terms of screening, we would screen overseas. Currently, the Yemen office is closed, so we would have to establish where the UNHCR determine the refugees, where they are in the region, and see if we can have a visa office in Saudi Arabia or Djibouti, or create a de-escalation zone within Yemen. And in terms of the resettlement, we do note that there is a difference between the Syrian and Yemenis in their literacy rate. So the Yemenis do have a lower literacy rate compared, so there may be a little bit of a delay in terms of resettlement. However, this is why we would choose to accept refugees with under 25,000.
So in regards to considerations of capacity, the immigration minister stated that 25,000 would be its capacity, but that is the capacity of IRCC, not of the entire Canadian government, and that has to be taken into consideration in this proposal, which we have done through organizational capacity of the Canadian government and our financial capacities as well. Specifically, to talk about the Syrian case in regards to when the rate of entries were occurring, for the first 3 months of their arrivals, it was about 10,000 refugees per month, which in this case is not what our recommended option is. We're recommending that it's a staggered approach, so the entry is actually quite level throughout the year that we're planning to implement the resettlement. So that's important to note. As well, with the graph, it's demonstrating that there is an issue in Canada where people believe that there is a very low employment rate among settling refugees. And so that is important. When we look at the graph, it's between 2002 to 2012. So this is showing that it's actually an issue that hasn't happened just with the Syrian refugees. It's something that has been a prolonged issue, especially in regards to government-sponsored refugees. The difference being private-sponsored refugees actually have a much higher rate of employment in the first year, but it actually evens out over time. So this is a bit of a false understanding of the issue.
The fourth consideration was with regards to public mood. While we recognize that Cabinet would likely have a discussion of the political implications, we just wanted to note that public opinion has been mixed on immigration broadly and in more specific instances. Most notably, the fact that the majority of Canadians identified that the irregular border crossings constituted a crisis. But we would also just want to note that on immigration overall, the public opinion has been mixed, and this generally typically changes between the methodology of polling instruments and the way the question is phrased. So for instance, ARI, Angus Reid Institute, and Environics, it changes on whether or not the question asks the specific target of 310,000 for the immigration levels versus just do you support immigration overall. We also do note at the federal level that it is in an election year and that this might change the way the government anticipates risk and reward, and also that immigration is a shared jurisdiction through federal, provincial, territorial agreements, and as such there is a duty to consult, though there is some leeway in cases of resettlement. And again, the government has issued certain statements with regards to being favorable for the UN Migration Compact. and that certain provinces, in particular the two largest, which we will focus on next, have different needs and different priorities and policies that need to be taken into account.
We do acknowledge that the two largest provinces, Ontario and Quebec, are the most affected by the backlog of the asylum seekers applications, and it's causing a strain on their resources because the refugee claimants are using the services of like social services and healthcare while waiting to hear a decision on their applications. And the federal government provided less than half of what the two provinces requested for in funding for that purpose. We do also acknowledge that there's a political priority announced by Ontario focusing on economic immigration, and by Quebec announcing that it wants to cut on immigration overall. So we do acknowledge that, and that's why we see that our recommended funding of the $15 million to IRB will be benefiting those two provinces in particular by eliminating the backlog and bringing a return on investment by reducing the number of refugee claimants using the services of the provinces.
So taking all of this into consideration, we do want to acknowledge that there is a second option not to take in any Yemeni refugees. This is something that the US and the EU have done, but we believe that this is not feasible because it would be inconsistent with our past policies. It would lower our credibility and reliability and would foster some public distrust in the Canadian public. There are, however, there would be some low costs if we did take this route. We would not have to worry about our control over insecurity, and it would satisfy some of the public. However, because of our past policies, we believe that it is not feasible for us to take refugees from one country and not another, and so we do believe that it is best for us to take in some refugees at this time.
The third option would be to accept a full 25,000 as the capacity was stated. This strength is that we are representing Canada at an international stage in a respective manner. We're demonstrating a leadership role in the international community. Weaknesses can include the stretched public resources that would result from that. And as well, we have to keep in mind the political positions right now. So when that type of thing happens, there is a lot of backlash possibly from the provinces, which we've analyzed within our option. So that has to be taken into account as well, and that is why we're proposing the option 1.
And to just summarize these three options across our considerations, we do believe that political or public mood will be varied on any of these situations between different actors and between different organizations being for or against. But we do believe that our 15,000 to 18,800 goal maximizes international relations capacity and control being compromised by accepting a higher number, particularly the 25,000 number, and international relations being compromised in the case of inaction.
Now, we did identify various risks that may come with our recommendation, with some of them higher probability and some of them lower probability. The one being with the highest is to have one province refuse, and that's why we recommend to delay our response to the UN, where we would allow this space for negotiations and focusing on private sponsorship and leveraging private support. If all the provinces were to refuse, we would explore eliminating the plan and providing funding to help with this Yemeni crisis abroad. And we also acknowledge that there's a risk of having a higher demand or a lower demand of private sponsorship based on our plan. So if we have a higher demand of private sponsorship, we can look into changing our targets. However, there are things to take into consideration. For example, the 25,000 capacity that we have, and we do know that there's also a backlog in the private sponsorship where there's people waiting to be sponsored privately. So we thought that there might be some number of Yemenis within that backlog of private private sponsorships, which may solve the problem if we found Yemenis in between. And if we had a shortage in demand, we can explore options such as the blended visa, private sponsorship, where the government would help in, and to share the responsibility with the private sector. Now, another high probability is regarding the backlog. We do know that Canada is not sending back any Haitians due to the situation in Haiti, and that might affect the return on investment in regards to clearing out the backlog. If the situation escalates in Yemen, that's another risk, and we do know that we might not be able, for security reasons, to send a political delegation, but we can create a committee with witnesses and have the screening done in neighboring countries.
So to implement our recommendation, we would have 3 phases: coordination, screening, and settlement, which we will now detail further. And then at the same time, we would implement our strategic communications plan.
The first phase of the implementation would be coordination. A lot of these issues are going to be happening all at once, so it's important to note that yes, this is a lot of things to be taking place between March and April, but it actually continues throughout the process, as you can see with the arrow. So the first and most important thing would be the political delegation to figure out what is happening in Yemen, what are the best options for the safety of the refugees and the safety of Canadians that are going. Another aspect would be to outreach to NGOs and for the Canadian government to look into organizations within Canada, within each province, such as OCASI and the TCRI. Those are both organizations within Ontario and Quebec, which deal with refugee settlement and immigration in regards to private sponsorship. So they have networks of private sponsors that we would be seeking to investigate on to figure out what is happening in that situation, what are the availabilities of those people. The other aspect would be the funding for the IRB. So that's to assist with the separate backlog of those claimants that are in Canada waiting to be determined. And the final aspect, which is very important to most situations where the resettlement is happening, would be polling of the Canadian citizens on the aspect of Yemenis and Yemen in general.
And part of the feasibility of this phase 1 is coordination with the UN in those first few months to get the plan off the ground. As we noted, the Canadian visa office in Yemen is currently closed. There are 3 in Saudi Arabia. There's also one in Oman and Djibouti. But again, it is a civil war situation where there might be refugees scattered on either side. So we might have to explore a variety of options, one being separate locations in Djibouti and Saudi Arabia, depending on which side of the front lines that they might fall. And also just navigating with IOM and UN to ensure that refugees and the Canadian security forces are protected throughout the process. And as we noted, one of the things that we floated was the idea of sending a political delegation, but as Mona introduced with the risks, we might be able to just substitute that with a committee report. And at this time, it's just something that we wanted to stress that we are concerned with security.
In phase 2, we will start the screening process, and based on our success with the Syrian refugee experience, we will do the screening process abroad, of course, based on the security situation, whether it be the designated location or other locations like Kyler mentioned. We do want to develop a plan where the refugees are able to submit additional documents throughout this beginning phase, like their academic credentials, for example, to be assessed and validated throughout like the beginning stage, so that it would eliminate their wait time here to go into the job market, and it will also help us to understand and assess their skills and know where they will be resettled in the best form and achieve success. After we go through the medical exams and the security check, they will be issued an entry visa to come to Canada, and the transportation will be arranged with the IOM. And once they arrive here, there will be interpreters, of course, to help them in the transitioning process.
And phase 3 includes the distribution of the refugees and their integration into Canadian society. So we would have to work with the federal, provincial, and territorial agreements, municipalities and NGOs for the settlement. And in terms of the economic integration, we have noted that for refugees, they are often, compared to their Canadian counterparts, they will start local businesses and will hire local workers. So that will also benefit the economic aspect.
So for a cost breakdown of this implementation idea, The estimation that we have made was between 168 million to 212 million. That is through an estimate from the Syrian Horizontal Initiative across intergovernmental agencies, where we concluded that it was 11,000 per person through their funding package. And so that is the estimate for our option of 15,000 to 18,800. There is an additional 15,000 recommended for the Immigration Refugee Board. That is, again, to deal with the additional backlog of refugee claimants made inland in Canada and at ports of entry and illegal border crossings. So that is a return on investment, because if we implement the 15 million, they will give additional funds to be able to screen these people faster. And we know that there is about a rate of 50-50 acceptance. So they will be not taxing the Canadian system, and specifically Ontario and Quebec, due to the fact that most of the irregular border crossers end up settling there. And they wait for their Immigration Refugee Board case to be filed for up to 2 years before it gets processed and determined. So by having that process go faster, it is having them be processed and remain in Canada where they deserve to be, or return home. That is the return on investment in that regard.
And to address our communication strategy, as we've noted on previous slides, this would be running throughout, and the key approach would be building on the past successes of the Syrian case, proactive mitigation of potential issues with regards to our recommended policy, and primarily leverage of private actors, particularly in the settlement phase, when people start coming in and the government will actually have something to show to garner support. Again, with the idea that our communication goals are directly linked to advancing our policy goals through key messages targeted to specific audiences, both with the public in our negotiations with the province and our negotiations with potential sponsors to garner support.
Now, it's very important to encounter some misunderstandings around the immigration system, such as line jumping and other factual errors in the media and the public, and that can be done through providing government fact sheets that explain the plan and the goals, so that no one can just jump to the numbers without understanding the whole process. We can also focus on success stories, as we have with the Syrian refugees, where the success stories were like born in like city papers, and they gained national and even international attention.
So to conclude, our proposed policy plan is controlled, safe, and welcoming, and it meets international and national expectations while doing so within the Canadian context.
Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention.
Puis-je poser une question en français?
Oui.
Absolument.
Il me semble que vous avez sous-estimé les problèmes avec les provinces, particulièrement Ontario. Est-ce que vous avez des commentaires sur ça? Parce que c'est pas juste une question de communication, c'est plutôt une question d'attitude politique et le problème de 200 millions de dollars.
Ouais. Si je peux juste indiquer quelque chose à propos de notre... je vais reculer jusqu'au coup, là. Juste pour savoir... alors, si on estime qu'il y a un backlog de à peu près 30 000 personnes qui ont croisé entre des frontières, si on estime ce numéro de 14 000, c'est donné par le PBO, par l'officier des budgets. Alors, c'est 14 000 par chacun de ces 30 000. Alors, si on estime même qu'un demi seront retournés chez eux, c'est 15 000 personnes. Si on même donne un numéro de 1 000 par personne qui va être sauvé, même seulement 1 ou 2 mois en avance, c'est déjà 15 millions. Si c'est 1 an, jusqu'au jour, on estime que c'est 2 ans pour éliminer le backlog. Si c'est même 1 an qu'on sauve, si on prend tous les
économies.
coûts.
I'm just conscious that some of our colleagues are not as
Oh,
fluent.
sorry, I can repeat
and
very
I'm wondering
quickly in
if you
French.
could just give a very
Yeah, I
quick
can do it in
recap.
bilingual. So just a very quick recap, essentially what I said is there's 30,000 irregular border crossings as part of the pending claims. If we even assume that 15,000 of them go, as long as we save $1,000 in the saved, it already pays for the 15 million. If we can save a full year of screening, that's a full year of health costs for 15,000 people. That ends up being proportionately larger, not quite the amount that is covered. But again, one of the things that we're stressing is that this is fully costed and fully identified. The Syrian case was a little bit different. The irregular border case was completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
just
Thank
keep
you
it
very
at
much.
that.
Can I jump in on that, Minister?
Yeah.
Just to say that, so this is a very comprehensive presentation. J'apprécie beaucoup la comprehensive information qui a été ici. But I just want to ask, can you put a number on the benefits, on the economic benefits? Very comprehensive, but in terms of the evaluation of each option, can we put an economic positive benefit estimate beside them and show Canadians that there's a benefit to it?
So I personally, when we were in the process of this objective, we considered different options to be, once we basically negated the option, we weren't doing much calculations financially just because the feasibility aspect wouldn't make sense. But within our option, we did a lot of financial analysis, and that is the numbers that we presented there. So you're asking for the other two options as well?
Well, I think we
In
want to know
general.
financial benefit.
Yeah.
Economic benefits.
Yeah.
Case for
Yeah, what's our story?
Yeah.
So the economic case for the no action is that there is no economic benefit. It's a net loss, almost guaranteed, even if we were to give funding proportionate to the amount that we would lose with nothing in return. Maybe some attempt to mitigate some sort of international support from that. Obviously, there's a higher cost to the $25,000, if only with regards to the quality of settlement services that we can provide, which, as we noted with the integration, if we can't provide quality services, they won't find jobs. So really the question, if we're evaluating those three options, if we're under assumption that that's the only one, I think what you'll find is there's a lot of leeway in that number. We tried to provide a range based on feasibility, but what will end up happening is that within that range, the target, just like all immigrations, would be to just take the midpoint, but what you'll find is that there is probably a specific number within that range that would maximize those, especially if you were to quantify what it is in terms of international relations that would benefit to Canada, and with regards to successful implementation being the primary gain. So really it's a financial
Who criticize us aren't
cost.
interested in our international reputation.
For sure.
So what we're kind of interested in is what we say when we're on the doorstep and they say, well, you know, you're spending all this money and what are we getting for it? We'd like to be able to say, well, we think it's about $36 million or whatever we think it is in terms of the benefit, the net benefit to Canada. And I'm sure you can work on that, but you know, I guess we're interested in whether you've have a sense of it already.
4 minutes, Minister.
In terms of, very briefly, the sense would be, again, primarily based on the gap between employment, is that the cost within 5 years, again, the 1 year to 5 year kind of gives a big time gap. We would just assume that they would approximately reach that level of 50% employment and that they would be able to fill gaps very quickly, again, cognizant of time. Part of what Mona introduced was screening based on education that would be incorporated into it. So part of the negotiation with provinces is primarily, although Ontario is focused on economic migrants, as long as we can make the case that these people are able to meet these education shortages in whatever aspects of industry, it's that kind of case. It's making a case that on the doorstep, we can give you 3,000 people that meet this educational profile, and so it's less of a burden on that aspect.
And what gives you confidence? You identify that the cohort is different, for instance, compared to the Syrian cohort that came in. Just what gives you confidence about that? And then how specifically you're relying about 2/3 through the private channels of resettlement and support. And I know that our colleagues are continually talking to us from the settlement agency world about pressure on resource. So how do you just reconcile those?
Well, when we look at the numbers of literacy, it's absolutely true that it's a little bit harder to predict what will actually happen from these refugees that arrive in Canada, because they have to be able to learn and grow from the experience and have a full integration settlement plan. So that is why the plan that we recommend should be in place. And once they arrive and the language skills occur, and the aspect that when immigrants come to Canada, they're more likely to start local businesses and unlike their Canadian counterparts, and more likely to hire local workers. That's demonstrative of small communities being able to grow, especially within the Maritimes. That's an important aspect that a lot of maritime provinces and Newfoundland consider. So I think that aspect can't fully be determined until they arrive and they are able to learn, and then from there, their education level will be determined by their skill and their desire.
But I mean, I applaud your recognition of the role of the settlement agencies. But you know, I can tell you that the settlement agencies are absolutely stressed and beyond capacity. So, what part of the budget? I want to know the actual dollars that are going to go to the settlement agencies, because I'm not going to be able to persuade them without those additional resources.
So we do know in the horizontal, there's a full breakdown that can address that from the Syrian case with regards. It's primarily, if I'm thinking correctly, it's about 2/3 of it is accorded to settlement services.
Yeah.
But maybe you could specifically share
So
your
you're
perspective on the
asking for
settlement
net
services.
new between, roughly speaking, $200 million there, and then an additional $15 million for the IRB, is that right?
Yes, the 15 million is in addition.
And so
Yeah.
I can tell the agencies that 2/3 of that budget is coming to them?
Yes.
Yeah, through the Syrian Horizontal Initiative, that was the roughly
That
the
was
figures
the
that they
breakdown.
stated. Yeah. We just made the full number through the estimate because we wanted to give you the numbers
Yeah.
of the actual cost for this specific circumstance.
And we would also acknowledge that our recommendation is suggesting that the Yemenis will not be coming in the same rate as the Syrians. The Syrians all came like in thousands within 3 months, and that's what actually put a load on the settlement sector. While in the recent years, the settlement sector has been more comfortable in dealing with the Syrian with
Kind of
the
adjusted.
Who are now becoming citizens and who are now back in the news
Yeah.
And are
in
helping
another
each other,
election
we
year.
hope.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, ministers, that's your time. We've got another presentation waiting. I want to thank our officials for coming in and sharing your advice.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
This here?